fire her or you'll regret it." The voice echoed through the glass walls of our Seattle architecture firm like a thunderclap. I looked up from my drafting table to see Ethan Blackwood, all 19 years of entitled fury, pointing directly at me through my office window. His face was flushed red, spittle flying as he screamed at his father, who stood behind him with the defeated posture of a man who'd lost control of his own son years ago. My name is Claire Dawson, and I'm 29 years old. For the past 4 years, I've worked as a senior architectural designer at Blackwood & Associates here in Seattle. I love what I do, creating spaces that matter, buildings that will stand for generations. What I don't love is watching a spoiled teenager destroy everything his father built simply because he can't handle being told no. This whole mess started last week when Ethan decided to override one of my structural recommendations on the Morrison Hotel project. He'd waltzed into my office during his summer leadership internship, a fancy title for nepotism, and demanded I change the foundation specifications to save money. When I explained that his suggested materials wouldn't meet earthquake safety standards, he'd laughed and called me overcautious. When I refused to sign off on his changes, his laugh turned cold. "You work for me now," he'd said, leaning against my desk like he owned it. "My dad might have hired you, but I'm the future of this company." I'd simply returned to my work, ignoring his tantrum. That had been my first mistake, not because I was wrong, but because I'd underestimated just how vindictive a 19-year-old with daddy issues could be. Now, watching him gesture wildly at his father through the conference room windows, I felt a chill run down my spine. Mr. Blackwood's shoulders sagged as he nodded slowly, glancing in my direction with what looked like genuine regret. The other employees had gone silent, their keyboards clicking to a halt as they watched the drama unfold. Ethan's voice carried even through the soundproofed glass. "She questioned my authority in front of the whole team. If you don't fire her today, I'll make sure you regret keeping her around." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was just beginning to burn. I knew then that this wasn't just about a disagreement over building materials. This was about power, respect, and a young man who'd never been told he couldn't have exactly what he wanted, exactly when he wanted it. As I watched Mr. Blackwood's face crumple under his son's demands, I realized that my 4 years of dedication might not be enough to protect me from the storm that was coming. The thing about working for a family business is that you're never really just an employee. You're caught in the crossfire of every family dysfunction, every unresolved conflict, every power struggle that should have been settled at the dinner table years ago. At Blackwood & Associates, that dysfunction had a name: Ethan Blackwood. I'd known about Ethan long before he started his internship last month. Mr. Blackwood, despite being one of Seattle's most respected architects, always spoke about his son with a mixture of pride and exhaustion. "He's got big ideas," he'd say, then add quietly, "maybe too big for his own good." What he never mentioned was that Ethan had been kicked out of 2 colleges for academic misconduct and had spent the last year burning through his trust fund on failed startup attempts. When Mr. Blackwood announced that Ethan would be joining us for the summer to learn the business from the ground up, I'd hoped it might humble the young man. Instead, it seemed to inflate his ego even further. Within days, he was strutting around the office like he'd already inherited the company, making demands and questioning decisions that had taken me years to earn the right to make. The Morrison Hotel project was my baby. I'd spent months working with the client, a boutique hotel chain, to design a building that would withstand Seattle's seismic activity while maintaining the aesthetic beauty they wanted. Every calculation had been triple-checked, every material choice justified by both safety requirements and budget constraints. When Ethan suggested we use cheaper foundation materials, I didn't just refuse on principle. I refused because people's lives were at stake. "You're being dramatic," he'd said when I explained the earthquake risks. "Buildings fall down because of bad design, not because of foundation materials." That comment alone showed me everything I needed to know about Ethan's understanding of architecture. But when I tried to educate him, he'd cut me off with a wave of his hand. "I don't need a lecture from someone who's never run a business," he'd snapped. "My dad built this company from nothing. I grew up hearing about every project, every decision. You think 4 years here makes you an expert?" The irony was that Mr. Blackwood had built his reputation on exactly the kind of meticulous attention to safety that I was advocating. But Ethan seemed to view his father's caution as weakness, something to be overcome rather than respected. As I watched him now through the conference room glass, gesticulating wildly while his father stood silent, I wondered if this was the first time Mr. Blackwood had ever really seen his son for who he'd become. The call came exactly 30 minutes after Ethan's meltdown. "Claire, could you come to my office, please?" Mr. Blackwood's voice was carefully neutral, but I could hear the weight of defeat underneath. He was going to fire me. After 4 years of successful projects, of staying late to meet deadlines, of building relationships with clients who specifically requested to work with me, all of it was about to end because a teenager couldn't handle being told no. I gathered my things slowly, taking one last look around the office that had been my sanctuary. The walls were covered with blueprints from projects I'd shepherded from concept to completion. The waterfront condominiums that had won a sustainability award, the community center that had revitalized a struggling neighborhood, the office building whose innovative design had been featured in Architectural Digest. All of it meant nothing now. When I knocked on Mr. Blackwood's door, he didn't look up from his desk. "Come in, Claire. Please, have a seat." I remained standing. "You're firing me." He finally met my eyes, and I saw years of disappointment etched into his face. Not disappointment in me, but in himself. "I'm sorry. I truly am. He's made it clear that he won't work with you, and he's family." "He's 19 years old," I said quietly. "He's been here for 1 month. I've been here for 4 years." "I know." His voice was barely above a whisper. "I know exactly what this looks like, and I hate myself for it. But he's my son, Claire. He's all I have left since my wife died, and if I don't support him now..." He trailed off, but I understood. This wasn't really about me or my job performance. This was about a father who'd lost his wife and was terrified of losing his son too, even if that son was destroying everything he'd worked to build. It was about guilt and grief and the desperate hope that maybe, somehow, giving Ethan what he wanted would finally make him the man his father needed him to be. But understanding Mr. Blackwood's motivations didn't make the betrayal hurt any less. I'd trusted this man, respected him, believed that merit mattered more than blood relationships. As I stood there watching him struggle to find words that might make this firing seem reasonable, I felt something shift inside me. The hurt was still there, sharp and fresh, but underneath it was something harder. Resolve. "Before you say anything else," I said, keeping my voice steady, "you should check your email." Mr. Blackwood frowned, glancing at his computer screen. "Claire, I don't think... Please, just check your email." He clicked on his inbox, and I watched his expression change from confusion to shock to something approaching horror. His face went pale, then ashen, as he read the subject line of the message I'd sent him just minutes before walking into his office. "Urgent. Safety violations and fraudulent documentation. Morrison Hotel Project." The silence stretched between us like a taut wire ready to snap. Mr. Blackwood's fingers hovered over his keyboard, trembling slightly as he opened the email. I watched his eyes scan the screen, growing wider with each line he read. The attachment I'd included was thorough. 23 pages of documentation that would destroy his son's future, and possibly his own. "Where did you get this?" His voice was hoarse, barely recognizable. "I've been documenting everything since Ethan arrived," I said. "At first, it was just to protect myself. I thought maybe he was making honest mistakes, and I wanted evidence to help train him properly. But then I realized the mistakes weren't honest at all. What I'd discovered had started small. Ethan had been staying late, which I'd initially found encouraging. Maybe he was finally taking the work seriously. But when I came in early one morning to prepare for a client meeting, I'd found him at my computer, trying to access the Morrison project files. He'd claimed he was just trying to learn, but something in his nervous laugh had made me suspicious. That suspicion had led me to check the version history on our shared files. What I found made my blood run cold. Ethan had been systematically altering safety reports, changing material specifications, and even forging my digital signature on documents. The cheap foundation materials he'd suggested weren't just a cost-cutting measure. He'd already ordered them, using falsified paperwork that made it look like I'd approved the changes. The Morrison client specifically chose us because of our safety record, I continued, watching Mr. Blackwood's face grow paler. They're building in a high-risk seismic zone. If we use those materials and there's an earthquake... I didn't need to finish the sentence. We both knew what would happen. The hotel would collapse, people would die, and Blackwood and Associates would face criminal charges for knowingly using substandard materials. The liability alone would bankrupt the company and land everyone involved in prison. But the Morrison project wasn't the only violation I'd uncovered. Ethan had been corresponding with contractors, using his father's email account to negotiate kickbacks on material purchases. He'd been skimming money from project budgets, hiding the theft by inflating labor costs on invoices. Most damning of all, he'd been selling proprietary designs to competitors, copying blueprints from our servers and passing them off as his own work. The Hartwell Plaza design, I said, naming our most recent competition loss. The winning firm's proposal was identical to ours. Even the unique sustainable heating system you spent months developing. They submitted their bid 2 days after Ethan accessed those files. Mr. Blackwood's hands were shaking now. How much money are we talking about? Based on what I could document, at least $200,000 in direct theft. But the real damage is the Morrison project. If that building had been constructed with Ethan's materials and something had happened... I paused, letting the implications sink in. We're talking about wrongful death lawsuits that could reach tens of millions. He closed his eyes, pressing his palms against his temples. And you've already sent this to someone else. The State Architecture Board received a copy this morning, I confirmed, along with the Attorney General's office and the Morrison client's legal team. I also forwarded everything to our insurance company, since they'll need to know about the potential liability issues. The door burst open without warning. Ethan stormed in, his face flushed with triumph. Dad, did you fire her yet? Because if you haven't, I'm calling grandfather's lawyer. The board will remove you as managing partner if you can't make simple personnel decisions. He stopped short when he saw his father's ashen face and my calm expression. What's going on? Ethan's confidence evaporated like morning mist as he took in the scene. His father sat hunched over his computer, staring at the screen with the hollow expression of a man watching his world collapse. I remained standing by the window, my arms crossed, waiting for the inevitable explosion. What is this? Ethan demanded, moving toward the desk. Dad, why do you look like someone died? Mr. Blackwood slowly turned the monitor so his son could see the email. Explain this to me, Ethan. Explain how my signature appears on purchase orders I never signed. Explain how materials that don't meet code somehow got approved for the Morrison project. I watched Ethan's face cycle through emotions. Confusion, recognition, fear, and finally, desperate defiance. That's fake, he said, his voice cracking. She's lying. She made this up because she's mad about being fired. The timestamps don't lie, I said quietly. Every document has a digital trail. Every login is recorded. The system shows exactly when you accessed my computer, exactly when you modified these files, exactly when you sent emails from your father's account. Ethan whirled to face me, and for a moment, I saw pure hatred in his eyes. You have no idea what you've done. Do you know who my family is? Who my grandfather knows? You think some made-up evidence is going to protect you when I destroy your career? Actually, I replied, I think the evidence is going to protect a lot of people from shoddy construction and potential tragedy. The reality of his situation was beginning to dawn on him. The Morrison Hotel wasn't just any project. It was a 20-story building designed to house hundreds of guests. If Ethan's substandard materials had been used and an earthquake struck, the death toll could have been catastrophic. The legal ramifications would extend far beyond civil lawsuits. We were talking about criminal negligence, possibly even manslaughter charges. "You can't prove intent," Ethan said, but his bravado was fading fast. "Maybe I made some mistakes with the paperwork, but—" "The email to Continental Contractors proves intent," I interrupted. "The one where you negotiated a $10,000 kickback for approving their inferior concrete. The one where you specifically mentioned that your father would never notice the switch because he trusts his people too much." Mr. Blackwood's head snapped up. "Continental? Ethan, please tell me you didn't take money from Continental." Continental Contractors had been blacklisted by most reputable firms in Seattle after a scandal involving toxic materials 3 years ago. Their concrete had caused structural failures in 2 buildings, leading to millions in damages and a class action lawsuit that was still ongoing. The fact that Ethan had even contacted them, let alone accepted money from them, showed a level of corruption that went beyond simple greed. "It wasn't supposed to matter," Ethan said, his voice now pleading. "The building inspectors never would have caught it. The materials would have held up for years, maybe decades. By the time anything happened, people would be dead," Mr. Blackwood said, his voice hollow. "My God, Ethan. What have you become?" The door opened again, and this time it was Janet from HR, followed by 2 men in dark suits. "Mr. Blackwood, these gentlemen are from the State Architecture Board. They'd like to speak with you about some irregularities in your recent project filings." Ethan's face went white as he realized that his father's career, the family business, and his own future had just walked through the door. The investigators were thorough and professional, but their presence transformed the office into something resembling a crime scene. They set up laptops on the conference table, requested access to our servers, and began the methodical process of documenting every violation I'd uncovered. Ethan sat in the corner, his earlier bravado completely gone, while his father answered questions with the defeated air of a man who knew his legacy was crumbling. "Miss Dawson," said the lead investigator, a stern woman named Detective Patricia Wells, "you mentioned in your report that you suspected fraud before today. Why didn't you come forward sooner?" I'd been expecting this question. I wanted to be certain. Accusations like this can destroy careers, and I needed irrefutable proof before I made them. When Ethan demanded that his father fire me this morning, I realized I couldn't wait any longer. The irony wasn't lost on me. If Ethan had simply left me alone, I might have taken weeks longer to compile the complete evidence. His tantrum had actually accelerated his own downfall by forcing me to act before he could destroy more evidence or cause additional damage. Detective Wells pulled up the Continental Contractors' correspondence on her laptop. "This email chain suggests that Mr. Ethan Blackwood was planning to use substandard materials on multiple projects, not just the Morrison Hotel. Have you verified the structural integrity of other buildings?" "I've only had time to review the Morrison project in detail," I replied. "But I flagged 3 other projects where similar material substitutions were made: the Hillcrest Medical Center, the Westfield Shopping Complex, and the Pine Street Apartments." Mr. Blackwood's face went even whiter, if that was possible. The Hillcrest Medical Center was a 5-story facility that housed a cardiac surgery unit. The Westfield Shopping Complex served thousands of customers daily. The Pine Street Apartments were low-income housing where families lived with their children. If any of those buildings failed during an earthquake, the casualties could be in the hundreds. "Dad, you have to understand," Ethan said suddenly, his voice desperate. "I was trying to save the company money. You're always talking about how tight margins are, how we're losing bids to cheaper competitors. I was just trying to help." "By committing fraud?" Detective Wells asked. "By endangering public safety?" "The buildings would have been fine. Ethan insisted. Continental's materials meet the basic requirements. They're just not as strong as the premium materials. The chance of an earthquake is tiny anyway. The chance of an earthquake in Seattle is actually quite significant, I said quietly. We're located on several active fault lines. It's not a matter of if, but when. The second investigator, Agent Rodriguez from the Attorney General's office, looked up from his notes. Mr. Blackwood, you'll need to halt construction on all active projects immediately until we can conduct a full safety review. Any buildings that have already been completed using these materials will need to be inspected and potentially retrofitted. The financial implications were staggering. Blackwood and Associates would be liable for the cost of retrofitting every building where substandard materials had been used. They'd face lawsuits from clients, regulatory fines, and almost certainly criminal charges. The company that Mr. Blackwood had spent 30 years building would be destroyed within months. "What about me?" Ethan asked, his voice small. "What happens to me?" Detective Wells closed her laptop and stood up. "Mr. Ethan Blackwood, you're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and reckless endangerment. You have the right to remain silent." As she read him his rights, I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice was being served, but watching a family destroy itself was never pleasant, even when that destruction was entirely self-inflicted. The handcuffs clicked shut around Ethan's wrists with a finality that seemed to echo through the entire office. His transformation from entitled prince to common criminal was complete, and everyone who had witnessed his arrogance over the past month was now watching him be led away by federal agents. The young man who had strutted through our offices demanding respect was now shuffling toward the elevator with his head down, his hands bound behind his back. "This is insane," he shouted over his shoulder as the agents guided him toward the exit. "Dad, call grandfather's lawyer. Call everyone. They can't do this to me." But Mr. Blackwood stood frozen behind his desk, staring at his son with the expression of someone who no longer recognized the person they were looking at. The realization that his child, his only child, was a criminal seemed to have broken something fundamental inside him. Detective Wells turned to address the growing crowd of employees who had gathered to watch the arrest. "This is an ongoing investigation," she announced. "All work on current projects is suspended pending safety reviews. Anyone with information about potential violations should contact our office immediately." As Ethan disappeared into the elevator, still protesting his innocence, I felt the eyes of my coworkers turning toward me. Some looked grateful. They'd seen Ethan's behavior and knew what kind of person he really was. Others seemed shocked that the quiet architect they'd worked with for 4 years had just brought down the boss's son. A few looked concerned, probably wondering if their own jobs were safe. Janet from HR approached me hesitantly. "Claire, I'm not sure what your status is right now. Technically, Mr. Blackwood was in the process of firing you when his son was arrested for fraud," I finished calmly. "I think my employment status is the least of anyone's concerns right now." The aftermath was swift and devastating. Within hours, news of Ethan's arrest had spread throughout Seattle's architectural community. Local media picked up the story, running headlines about the trust fund architect who had risked public safety for personal profit. The Morrison Hotel client immediately terminated their contract and threatened a lawsuit. Other clients began calling to demand explanations about the safety of their projects. Mr. Blackwood aged 10 years in a single day. He spent the afternoon on conference calls with lawyers, insurance companies, and the state architecture board, each conversation leaving him more deflated than the last. When the board announced they were launching a formal investigation that could result in the permanent revocation of his license, he simply sat in his office, staring out the window at the Seattle skyline his buildings had helped create. By evening, the inevitable happened. The board of directors, led by Ethan's grandfather, called an emergency meeting. Mr. Blackwood was given a choice: resign voluntarily or be removed for cause. The family business that had been his life's work would continue under new leadership, but his name would be quietly erased from the letterhead. "I built this company to leave something meaningful for my son," he told me during our final conversation. Instead, I leave him facing 20 years in federal prison. The irony was perfect in its cruelty. Ethan had demanded that his father choose between his son and his employee. In the end, that choice had been made for him, by Ethan himself, through his own criminal actions. The spoiled young man who had thought himself untouchable had destroyed not only his own future, but his father's legacy as well. As I cleaned out my office that evening, I wondered if Ethan finally understood that actions have consequences, or if he was still blaming everyone else for his downfall. 3 months later, the full scope of Ethan's crimes had been revealed. Federal investigators found evidence of fraud totaling over $800,000 across multiple projects. His kickback scheme with Continental contractors had endangered the structural integrity of 7 buildings throughout Seattle. The Pine Street apartments, which housed low-income families, had to be evacuated when inspectors found critical weaknesses in the foundation. Ethan pleaded guilty to fraud, conspiracy, and reckless endangerment, receiving a sentence of 15 years in federal prison. His grandfather, humiliated by the scandal, cut off all financial support, leaving Ethan to face his punishment without the family wealth that had enabled his arrogance. The once confident young man who had believed himself above consequences now spent his days in an orange jumpsuit, working in the prison laundry for 30 cents an hour. Mr. Blackwood's health deteriorated rapidly after losing his company and his son. He suffered a mild heart attack 2 months after the scandal broke, and now lived quietly in a modest apartment, his reputation in ruins and his architectural license permanently revoked. As for me, the new management at the firm, now renamed Seattle Structural Design, offered me Ethan's intended position as project director. I accepted, not out of revenge, but because someone needed to ensure that the buildings we designed would actually protect the people who use them. On my first day in my new office, I looked out at the city skyline and thought about how differently things might have gone if I had simply accepted Ethan's demands and kept quiet. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't in shouting back at those who try to destroy you. It's in staying silent until the perfect moment to let their own actions speak louder than any words ever could.